Mark Thompson wasn't the kind of guy who complained about life, even though life had thrown more than its fair share of challenges his way. A single dad to 2 kids, Liam, who was 9, and Sophie, just 6. He spent most days balancing between being a parent and trying to make ends meet as a carpenter. His wife Rachel had passed away 5 years ago after a sudden illness, leaving him to figure out how to raise their children alone. It wasn't easy, but Mark did what he always did. He worked hard, kept his head down, and tried not to think too much about the things he couldn't change. His workshop was small, tucked away in the corner of their modest backyard. The tools were old, some rusted, others held together with duct tape, but they still worked well enough for him to take on odd jobs around town. He fixed fences, repaired cabinets, and occasionally built furniture for people who needed something custom-made. Most weeks the money came in slow, but it was enough to keep food on the table and pay the bills. Sometimes, though, when the truck broke down or Liam needed new shoes for school, Mark would skip meals just so the kids wouldn't have to go without. That's just how he was. He put them first, no matter what. One crisp autumn morning, as Mark sipped his coffee while sitting on the front step of their little house, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Normally, he'd ignore calls like that, figuring it was probably another telemarketer selling something he didn't need. But today, for some reason, he picked up. On the other end was a soft, gentle voice. "Hello? Is this Mark Thompson?" the woman asked. "Yes, this is Mark," he replied, wiping sawdust off his hands onto his jeans. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she said. "I heard you're a carpenter, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me with a project." Mark leaned forward, suddenly interested. Work was work, especially these days. "Sure, ma'am. What do you need done?" "Well, my porch has seen better days," Evelyn explained. "A few boards are cracked and there's some rot near the steps. Nothing major, but it needs attention before winter sets in." Mark nodded, already picturing the job in his mind. Porch repairs weren't glamorous, but they paid okay, and he could finish it quickly if the damage wasn't too bad. Plus, working outside meant he wouldn't have to deal with cramped spaces or messy interiors. "Sounds good," he told her. "When would you like me to come by?" "How about tomorrow morning, around 8? She suggested. "8 works fine," Mark said, jotting down her address. As soon as he hung up, though, he frowned. The street name sounded familiar. It was one of those neighborhoods on the nicer side of town, where houses were big and yards were perfectly manicured. Not exactly his usual stomping grounds. Still, a job was a job, and he couldn't afford to turn anything down right now. The next day, Mark loaded his tools into his beat-up old truck and drove over to Evelyn's place. As he pulled onto the quiet, tree-lined street, he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. Every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Fresh paint, shiny windows, flower beds bursting with color. Compared to his own neighborhood, where cars sat on blocks and weeds grew wild in empty lots, this felt almost surreal. Evelyn's house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a charming 2-story home with white shutters and a wraparound porch. She greeted him at the door wearing a simple sweater and slacks, her silver hair tied back neatly. Her smile was warm, inviting, but there was something else in her expression. A hint of sadness, maybe, or tiredness. Mark couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Let me show you the porch." As they walked outside, Mark took stock of the damage. Sure enough, a couple of boards were loose and a section near the railing showed signs of water damage. Nothing he couldn't handle. He gave Evelyn a quick estimate of how long it would take and promised to get started right away. Over the next hour, as Mark measured and assessed the porch, Evelyn lingered nearby, watching silently. Eventually, she spoke up. "You seem very thorough," she remarked. "Do you enjoy carpentry?" Mark paused, considering the question. "It's not just about enjoying it," he said honestly. "It's practical. I like knowing I can fix things, build things. Makes me feel useful, you know?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Yes, I understand that feeling," she murmured. Then, changing the subject, she added, "Would You like some coffee or maybe water?" "That'd be great, thanks," Mark said, grateful for the break. As Evelyn disappeared inside, he glanced around again, taking in the details of her property. There was something oddly uniform about the neighboring houses. The same style of gates, similar landscaping, even identical mailboxes lining the curb. At first he chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe the developer who built the neighborhood had used the same blueprint for all the homes. But deep down, he sensed there was more to it. When Evelyn returned with a steaming mug of coffee, Mark thanked her and took a sip. It was strong, just the way he liked it. They chatted casually for a few minutes about the weather, the upcoming holidays, random bits of small talk. Yet beneath the surface, Mark felt a strange curiosity growing. Who was this woman, and why did this neighborhood feel so different? The next morning, Mark arrived at Evelyn's house bright and early, ready to tackle the porch repairs. The air was crisp, and a light mist hung over the neighborhood, giving everything a soft, almost dreamlike quality. He parked his truck by the curb, unloaded his tools, and got to work. The damage wasn't as bad as he'd initially thought, just a few rotten boards and some loose railings, but he knew better than to rush. If there was one thing Rachel had taught him before she passed, it was that doing a job right mattered, more than doing it fast. Evelyn came out after a while, carrying a tray with 2 mugs of coffee and a plate of cookies. "I thought you might need a break," she said with a small smile, setting the tray down on a nearby table. Mark straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though he couldn't hide the gratitude in his voice. "But I won't say no." They sat together for a few minutes, sipping coffee and chatting about nothing in particular. Evelyn asked about his kids, and Mark told her how Liam loved soccer, but struggled with math, while Sophie was obsessed with drawing pictures of animals. Evelyn listened intently, nodding occasionally, her expression softening as if she were imagining the 2 children herself. "And what about you?" she asked finally. "What do you enjoy when you're not fixing porches?" Mark chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Honestly, not much these days. Between work and the kids, there isn't a lot of time for hobbies, but I used to love woodworking. Not just fixing things, but creating them. Building something from scratch gives you a sense of accomplishment, you know?" Evelyn nodded again, her eyes distant for a moment. "I can imagine," she said quietly. Then, shaking herself slightly, she added, "Well, maybe someday you'll find the time to get back to it." As the days went on, Mark grew more comfortable around Evelyn. She checked in regularly, always bringing him snacks or drinks, sometimes just stopping by to see how things were going. There was an ease between them, a quiet understanding that made their conversations flow naturally. Yet despite her kindness, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Evelyn than met the eye. She seemed content, yes, but also lonely. It was in the way she lingered during their talks, reluctant to leave, or the way her smile faltered ever so slightly when she thought no one was looking. One afternoon, as Mark was prying up a particularly stubborn board, his hammer slipped and clattered loudly against the concrete. Cursing under his breath, he bent down to pick it up, only to realize it had rolled underneath the porch. Sighing, he grabbed a flashlight and crawled beneath the structure to retrieve it. What he found there stopped him cold. Stacked neatly in waterproof containers were rolls of blueprints, architectural plans, and sketches of houses. Dozens of them. Some looked familiar, like the homes in this very neighborhood, while others were completely new designs. Mark hesitated, curiosity getting the better of him. He picked up one of the plans and unrolled it, squinting in the dim light to make out the details. They were meticulous, professional-grade drawings, clearly done by someone who knew what they were doing. Before he could examine further, a shadow fell across him, and Evelyn's voice called out sharply, "What are you doing?" Startled, Mark scrambled backward, nearly hitting his head on the underside of the porch. "Sorry," he stammered, holding up the blueprint like evidence. "My hammer rolled under here and I saw these. I didn't mean to snoop, I swear." For a moment, Evelyn stood frozen, her face pale. Then, exhaling deeply, she knelt beside him. "It's all right," she said, though her tone was tight. "Those are personal projects I've been working on, nothing important." Mark handed the blueprint back awkwardly, feeling like he'd crossed some invisible line. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I didn't mean to intrude." Evelyn forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't worry about it," she said, tucking the plans back into their container. "Let's focus on finishing the porch, shall we?" Though she acted calm, Mark could tell the incident had unsettled her. For the rest of the day, she kept her distance, only checking in briefly to see if he needed anything. He tried not to dwell on it, telling himself it was none of his business. Still, the memory of those blueprints lingered in the back of his mind, nagging at him like an unanswered question. By the third day, the porch was nearly complete. Mark sanded down the last of the new boards, staining them to match the original wood. As he worked, he noticed subtle things about Evelyn's property that he hadn't paid attention to before. The intricate ironwork on the gates, the perfectly aligned flower beds, even the fact that the neighboring houses seemed eerily similar in design. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, assuming the neighborhood simply shared a common aesthetic. But then he started noticing other details. The same mailbox styles, identical driveway patterns, even matching window frames. Curiosity gnawed at him, but Mark pushed it aside. He was here to do a job, not play detective. Besides, Evelyn had been nothing but kind to him. Whatever secrets she might be keeping weren't his to uncover. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Evelyn approached him once more. This time she carried a glass of lemonade instead of coffee. "How's it coming along?" she asked, handing him the drink. "Almost done," Mark replied, taking a sip. "Just a few finishing touches tomorrow and it'll be good as new." Evelyn smiled, though there was a wistfulness to it that made Mark pause. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. You've been wonderful to work with." Mark shrugged, embarrassed by the compliment. "Just doing my job." "No," Evelyn said firmly. "It's more than that. You care about your work, and it shows. That's rare these days." Her words caught him off guard, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Instead, they stood side by side, watching the sky turn, shades of pink and orange. In that silence, Mark felt a strange connection to Evelyn, a shared understanding of loss, resilience, and the quiet determination to keep moving forward. As he packed up his tools and headed home that night, Mark couldn't help but wonder what lay beneath Evelyn's polished exterior. Who was she really? And why did this neighborhood feel so deliberate? He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was certain. Repairing Evelyn's porch had opened a door he hadn't expected. One that led to questions far bigger than loose boards and rotting wood. The porch was finally finished, and Mark couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he stood back to admire his work. The once damaged boards were replaced with sturdy, freshly stained wood that blended seamlessly with the rest of the structure. The railing was secure again, and the steps no longer creaked underfoot. It wasn't just functional, it looked good, like it belonged to a house in a magazine spread. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She walked slowly, testing each step with deliberate care before turning to face him. "It's perfect," she said, her voice soft but full of sincerity. "You've done an incredible job." Mark scratched the back of his neck, feeling a little awkward at the praise. "Just doing what I'm paid for," he muttered, though he couldn't hide the small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him with those piercing eyes of hers. "No, it's more than that. You didn't have to put this much effort into it, but you did. That says something about who you are." Her words caught him off guard, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. Instead, he busied himself, packing up his tools, stacking hammers and screwdrivers into their worn-out toolbox. Evelyn watched him quietly, her expression thoughtful, almost wistful. When he finished loading everything into his truck, she surprised him by saying, "Why, don't you bring your kids over for dinner tonight? I'd love to meet them." Mark froze, his hand gripping the edge of the tailgate. Dinner? At Evelyn's house? He hadn't expected that, Sure, they'd grown friendly over the past week, but inviting his family over felt intimate, personal. He hesitated, unsure if he should accept. "They're great kids," he said finally, buying himself a few seconds to think. "But we don't want to impose nonsense," Evelyn interrupted gently. "I insist. Besides, it'll be nice to have some company. It gets lonely here sometimes." Something in the way she said it, the slight tremor in her voice, the way she glanced away as if embarrassed, made Mark nod without thinking twice. "All right," he said. "We'll come. Thank you." That evening, Mark sat at the kitchen table with Liam and Sophie explaining the plan. "So, remember Mrs. Harper, the lady whose porch I fixed?" he began, stirring sugar into his coffee. "She invited us over for dinner tonight." Liam wrinkled his nose. "Why does she want us to come?" "Because she's nice," Sophie chimed in, swinging her legs under the table. "And maybe she wants to see our pictures." She held up a crumpled drawing of a cat wearing sunglasses, which she had proudly shown everyone within a 5-mile radius. Mark chuckled. "Maybe. Either way, we're going. So let's clean up and get ready, okay?" By the time they arrived at Evelyn's house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a warm orange glow. Evelyn greeted them at the door, dressed casually in slacks and a sweater. She smiled warmly as Liam and Sophie shuffled inside, clutching their jackets nervously. "This is Liam," Mark introduced, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And this is Sophie." "It's so nice to meet you both," Evelyn said, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "Are you the artist I've heard so much about?" Sophie beamed, pulling out her drawing. "I made this for you." Evelyn took it carefully, her eyes lighting up. "Wow, this is amazing. Look at those sunglasses. They're fabulous." She pinned the picture to her fridge with a magnet shaped like a flower. "Now it's part of my collection." Dinner was simple but delicious. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade apple pie for dessert. As they ate, Evelyn asked the kids about school, their favorite games, and whether they liked living in the town. Liam talked animatedly about his soccer team, while Sophie described her imaginary world where cats ruled the planet. Evelyn listened, intently, laughing at all the right moments, making the kids feel like they were the most interesting people she'd ever met. Watching her interact with his children, Mark realized something. He hadn't seen Evelyn smile like this before. There was a lightness to her now, a warmth that seemed to fill the room. For the first time, he wondered if loneliness was a bigger part of her life than she let on. After dinner, Evelyn cleared the plates and brought out a photo album. "Would you like to see some pictures of when I was younger?" she asked, opening it to a page filled with faded snapshots. There she was, decades younger, standing beside a man in a suit. The resemblance between them was striking. They shared the same sharp jawline and confident posture, but there was tension in the way they stood apart from each other, even in the photos meant to look happy. "That's my late husband, Evelyn," explained, tracing the edge of the picture with her finger. "He built most of these houses in the neighborhood. We worked together for years, but..." She trailed off, her voice catching slightly. "Let's just say we didn't always agree on things." Mark leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What happened?" Evelyn sighed, closing the album. "He was brilliant, really, a visionary, but he cared more about success than people. I wanted to use our wealth to help others, to make sure families could afford to live here. He thought I was too sentimental. After he passed, I decided to honor his legacy by building homes, but also by staying true to my values." It was the most personal thing she'd ever shared with him, and Mark found himself respecting her even more. Here was a woman who had faced loss and heartache, yet chose to keep giving back to her community. It reminded him of his own struggles after Rachel died, how overwhelming it had felt to carry on alone, but how important it was to find meaning in the pain. As the evening wound down, Evelyn walked them to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said, hugging Sophie tightly before shaking Liam's hand. "You two are wonderful." On the drive home, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window. Liam stared out into the darkness, unusually quiet. Finally, he turned to Mark and asked, "Do you think she's sad, Dad?" Mark glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Why do you ask that?" "She smiles a lot, but her eyes look sad sometimes, like Grandma used to." Mark swallowed hard, surprised by his son's insight. "Yeah, buddy," he said softly. "I think she might be, but maybe having us around helps her feel better." Liam nodded, satisfied with the answer. Mark focused on the road ahead, his mind racing. He'd gone into this project thinking it was just another job, a way to earn money and provide for his family. But now he realized it was something more. Evelyn wasn't just a client. She was someone who understood what it meant to lose someone you loved, to carry that weight every single day. And somehow, in fixing her porch, he'd started mending something else entirely. As he pulled into their driveway, Mark made a decision. Tomorrow he'd call Evelyn and offer to help with any other projects she might need. Not because he needed the work, but because he wanted to. Because in a strange way, helping her felt like helping himself. And maybe, just maybe, they could both find a little bit of healing along the way. The next morning, Mark woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know exactly why, but the idea of reaching out to Evelyn and offering his help again felt right. It wasn't just about work, it was about connection. Maybe it was the way she'd opened up during dinner, sharing pieces of her life that made him realize how much they had in common. Or maybe it was the quiet determination he saw in her, the same stubborn hope that kept him going day after day. After breakfast, while Sophie colored at the kitchen table and Liam played soccer outside, Mark picked up the phone and dialed Evelyn's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and steady. "Good morning, Mark," she said, as if she'd been expecting his call. "Morning, Evelyn," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Listen, I've been thinking. If you've got any more projects around the neighborhood, I'd be happy to take them on. My schedule's pretty open for the next few weeks." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Mark worried he'd overstepped. But then Evelyn spoke, her tone thoughtful. "Actually, there is something I've been considering. Several houses in the area could use some attention. New roofs, updated kitchens, maybe even fresh coats of paint. Nothing urgent, but I think it would make a difference." Mark perked up immediately. "That sounds like a solid plan. Let me know what you need and I'll get started." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said warmly. "But before we dive into anything, let's sit down and talk about it. There's more to this than just repairs." They agreed to meet later that afternoon, and when Mark arrived at Evelyn's house, he found her waiting on the porch with a stack of papers spread across the table. The crisp autumn breeze ruffled the edges of the documents, and she quickly gathered them together before inviting him to sit. "These are plans I've been working on," she explained, laying out sketches and blueprints. "Some of these homes have been here since my husband built them decades ago. They're beautiful, but they're starting to show their age. I want to update them, not just for looks, but to make sure they stay affordable and livable for families." Mark leaned forward, studying the drawings. They were detailed, precise, and clearly designed with care. "This is impressive," he said honestly. "You've put a lot of thought into this." Evelyn nodded, though her expression remained serious. "It's not just about renovating houses, Mark. It's about preserving a community. When my husband passed, I inherited all of this, the properties, the responsibility. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with it, but over the years, I've realized that these homes mean something. To the people who live here, they're more than just walls and roofs. They're where memories are made." Her words resonated deeply with Mark. He thought about his own home, the creaky floors, the peeling wallpaper, the tiny backyard where Liam practiced soccer and Sophie chased butterflies. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A place where they laughed, argued, and loved each other through thick and thin. "I understand," he said softly. "A house isn't just a building. It's a sanctuary." Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Exactly. And that's why I want to do this right. Not just slap on a coat of paint and call it done, but really invest in making these places better, for the people who live in them now." and for whoever comes next. Mark felt a spark of excitement ignite within him. This wasn't just another job. It was an opportunity to create something meaningful. "Count me in," he said firmly. "I'll handle whatever you need." Over the next hour, they went over the details. Evelyn outlined which houses needed the most attention and prioritized tasks based on urgency and impact. Mark took notes, jotting down ideas for materials and timelines. By the time they wrapped up, he already had a mental image of how everything would come together. As he packed up his notebook and stood to leave, Evelyn stopped him. "One more thing," she said, her voice hesitant. "This project, it might require more than just your skills. You'll need to coordinate with contractors, manage budgets, maybe even oversee crews. Are you comfortable taking on that kind of role?" Mark hesitated. Truthfully, he'd never managed anything on this scale before. His experience was limited to small jobs, fixing fences, repairing cabinets, building furniture. But something inside him refused to back down. If Evelyn believed in him, maybe it was time he believed in himself too. "I'll figure it out," he said confidently. "If I run into trouble, I'll ask for help, but I won't let you down." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's do this." Over the following weeks, Mark threw himself into the project with a level of dedication that surprised even him. He spent hours researching materials, comparing prices, and sketching out timelines. He reached out to local contractors, explaining the vision Evelyn had shared with him and asking for their best rates. Slowly but surely, a team began to form, a mix of experienced professionals and eager newcomers willing to learn. Every morning, Mark drove from one house to the next, checking progress, solving problems, and ensuring everyone stayed on track. Some days were exhausting, filled with unexpected challenges like leaking pipes or faulty wiring. Other days were rewarding, like when a freshly painted wall transformed a drab living room into a bright, welcoming space. Through it all, Evelyn remained a constant presence. She visited the sites regularly, offering input and encouragement. Her knowledge of architecture proved invaluable, and her ability to smooth over disagreements between workers kept the project running smoothly. More than once, Mark caught himself marveling at how effortlessly she commanded respect, not because of her wealth or status, but because of the genuine care she showed for everyone involved. As the renovations progressed, Mark noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Residents who had previously kept to themselves started coming out to chat, curious about the improvements being made. Kids rode bikes along newly paved driveways, and elderly neighbors sat on porches, watching the transformation unfold. It was as if the entire community was waking up, rediscovering its spirit. One afternoon, while inspecting a newly installed roof, Mark struck up a conversation with Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from Evelyn. "You know," she said, leaning on her cane, "this place hasn't felt this alive in years. Ever since Mr. Harper passed, things sort of slowed down. But now, it's like the heart of the neighborhood is beating again." Mark smiled, glancing toward Evelyn, who was deep in discussion with a contractor nearby. "She's something else, isn't she?" he said. Mrs. Peterson nodded. "Oh yes, that woman has poured her soul into keeping this place together. Most folks don't realize how much she does behind the scenes, helping families pay rent during tough times, organizing food drives, even covering medical bills when someone can't afford it. She doesn't do it for recognition, though, just because it's the right thing to do." Mark listened quietly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He'd known Evelyn was generous, but hearing stories like this gave him a deeper appreciation for the weight she carried and the grace with which she bore it. By the time winter rolled around, several houses gleamed with new windows, sturdy roofs, and freshly painted exteriors. Neighbors hosted a small gathering to celebrate the progress, grilling burgers and roasting marshmallows in the crisp evening air. Evelyn stood off to the side, watching the scene with a contented smile. "You did good," Mark said, joining her. "All of this, it's amazing. It's not just me. Evelyn replied, shaking her head. "You've done incredible work, Mark. I couldn't have done this without you." He shrugged modestly, though warmth spread through his chest. "We make a good team." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark allowed himself to imagine a future beyond survival. Maybe, just maybe, this partnership with Evelyn could lead to bigger opportunities. Not just for him, but for his kids too. As fireworks lit up the night sky, signaling the end of the celebration, Mark realized something important. Rebuilding houses wasn't just about fixing wood and nails. It was about creating a foundation, a place where people could thrive, grow, and find happiness. And in doing so, he and Evelyn had begun to rebuild something else entirely. Trust, friendship, and perhaps even the possibility of love. As the weeks turned into months, Mark found himself settling into a rhythm he hadn't experienced in years. The renovation project wasn't just about fixing houses anymore. It was about building connections, creating something meaningful for people who deserved it. Every morning he drove through the neighborhood with a sense of excitement, eager to see how far they'd come and what still lay ahead. It was hard work, no doubt, but it didn't feel like a burden. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt alive. Evelyn remained at the center of everything, her quiet leadership guiding the team through challenges big and small. She had a way of making everyone feel valued, whether it was complimenting a contractor on their craftsmanship or bringing coffee to workers on chilly mornings. Mark noticed how people responded to her kindness, how they went out of their way to ensure the job was done right because they didn't want to let her down. But beyond her generosity, Evelyn carried an air of vulnerability that made her relatable. There were moments when Mark caught her staring off into the distance, lost in thought, as if she were carrying a weight she couldn't quite put down. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of installing new plumbing in one of the older homes, Mark and Evelyn sat together on her porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The golden light bathed the freshly painted houses in warmth, casting long shadows across manicured lawns. It was peaceful, almost magical. "You've been amazing," Evelyn said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I don't think I've ever seen someone throw themselves into a project the way you have." Mark chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just me. You're the one who dreamed this up. I'm just helping make it happen." "That's not true," Evelyn countered gently. "You bring heart to this work, Mark. Heart and grit. People notice that. They respect it." Her words landed somewhere deep inside him, stirring emotions he hadn't fully acknowledged before. He glanced at her profile, the soft curve of her smile, the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of both joy and sorrow, and realized how much she reminded him of himself. They were two people who had faced loss, struggled to keep moving forward, and somehow found strength in doing good for others. "Do you ever miss it?" Mark asked after a pause. "Your husband, I mean. Do you miss having someone close?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sadness. "Every day. We weren't perfect, you know. He was brilliant, driven, but sometimes distant. I loved him, and I know he loved me, but we didn't always connect the way I wished we could. After he passed, I threw myself into his vision for these homes, hoping it would fill the void. But it didn't. Not really." Mark nodded, understanding more than she might realize. "It's funny, isn't it? How life keeps moving even when you feel like it should stop. Like the world expects you to figure things out on your own." "Exactly," Evelyn whispered. "But maybe part of healing is learning to lean on others again. To trust that it's okay to let someone in." The conversation lingered in the air between them, unspoken, yet heavy with meaning. Neither of them said anything for a while, letting the moment stretch until the sky darkened and stars began to twinkle overhead. The renovations continued, each house revealing its own story as they worked on it. Some were filled with laughter, the sound of kids playing in newly repaired rooms or couples marveling at updated kitchens. Others held echoes of pain, memories of struggles endured within those walls. Mark learned quickly that every home carried its own history, just like every person did. And Evelyn understood this better than anyone. One afternoon, while overseeing the installation of new flooring in a corner unit, Mark met a young single mother named Lisa. She lived there with her 3-year-old daughter, Mia, and had been struggling to keep up with rent since losing her job earlier that year. Evelyn had quietly covered several months' worth of payments without telling anyone, ensuring Lisa and Mia could stay in their home. When Lisa found out, she approached Mark during a break, tears streaming down her face. "Please tell Mrs. Harper thank you," she said, clutching his arm. "She saved us. Without her, I don't know where we'd be." Mark promised to pass along the message, though he knew Evelyn wouldn't expect gratitude. That was just who she was, someone who gave without expecting anything in return. Still, seeing the impact of her actions firsthand made him admire her even more. By spring, the neighborhood looked transformed. Brightly colored doors greeted visitors, flower boxes overflowed with blooms, and sidewalks buzzed with activity as neighbors chatted and kids played tag. What had once felt like a collection of individual houses now seemed like a true community, a place where people cared for one another. To celebrate, Evelyn organized a block party. Tables lined the street, laden with food donated by local businesses, and homemade dishes brought by residents. Music played softly in the background and strings of lights twinkled above, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Everyone came, families, friends, even some former tenants who had moved away but returned for the occasion. As the evening wore on, Evelyn stood at the head of the gathering, holding a microphone. Her voice trembled slightly as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her eyes scanning the sea of smiling faces. "This neighborhood has been my home for decades, and it means the world to me to see it thriving again. But none of this would have been possible without the incredible people standing before me." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I've decided to take a step further. Many of you have rented these homes for years, raising families and building lives here. Starting next month, I'll be offering ownership opportunities to long-term tenants at prices designed to keep this community accessible for generations to come." A wave of applause swept through the crowd, followed by cheers and whistles. Mark watched from the sidelines, feeling a lump rise in his throat. This was Evelyn's legacy, her way of ensuring that the neighborhood she loved would continue to thrive long after she was gone. Later that night, as the party wound down and guests began heading home, Evelyn sought out Mark. She looked tired, but happy, her cheeks flushed from the cool night air. "What you've done here," Mark started, shaking his head in awe. "It's incredible. You've changed lives, including mine." Evelyn smiled softly, placing a hand on his arm. "And you've reminded me why I love this place," she replied. "Why it's worth fighting for." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Fireflies danced in the darkness, and the distant hum of crickets filled the silence. Then, slowly, Evelyn leaned in and rested her head against his shoulder. Mark froze, unsure of what to do, but then he relaxed, letting the moment unfold naturally. In that quiet embrace, surrounded by the laughter and chatter of a grateful community, Mark realized something profound. Rebuilding houses wasn't just about restoring structures. It was about mending hearts. And somewhere along the way, he and Evelyn had begun to heal each other too. The block party stretched late into the night, with laughter echoing through the streets and the smell of grilled food lingering in the air. By the time the last guests left, the neighborhood was quiet again, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn stood on her porch watching as Mark packed up the last of the chairs and tables. The lights strung overhead swayed gently, casting a warm glow over everything. "You didn't have to stay this late," she said, stepping down to join him. "I could have handled the cleanup." Mark shook his head, stacking one folding chair atop another. "Nah, it's fine. Besides, I don't mind sticking around. Feels like, I don't know, closure or something." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Closure?" "Yeah," he admitted, brushing his hands against his jeans. "This whole project, it hasn't just been about fixing houses. It's been about people, about rebuilding lives. And now that it's done, it feels complete, you know? She nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. It does feel that way. But it's not really over, is it? Not entirely. These homes, this community, they're going to keep growing, changing, evolving. Mark smiled faintly. Yeah, I guess you're right. Nothing ever truly ends, does it? They stood there for a moment, side by side, taking in the stillness of the night. The neighborhood looked peaceful under the starlit sky, its freshly painted walls gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was hard to believe how much had changed since Mark first arrived to fix Evelyn's porch. Back then, he'd been focused only on survival, on scraping together enough money to keep his family afloat. Now, standing here with Evelyn, he realized he'd found something far more valuable than financial stability. He'd found purpose. The next morning, Mark woke up early as usual, but instead of heading straight to work, he took a few minutes to sit on his own porch sipping coffee and thinking about everything that had happened over the past months. His kids were still asleep inside, their laughter from the previous night, still fresh in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just about his future, but about theirs too. Later that day, he stopped by Evelyn's house to discuss some final details about the ownership transition plan. As they sat at her dining table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, Evelyn brought up a topic that caught him off guard. "You've done so much for this community," she said, tapping her pen lightly against the edge of a document. "Have you thought about what comes next, for you, I mean?" Mark frowned, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You've shown incredible leadership during this project. Managed crews, coordinated timelines, solved problems. Do you think you might want to take on bigger projects in the future? Maybe even start your own business?" Mark blinked, stunned. The idea had never crossed his mind. Sure, he'd enjoyed the challenge of managing the renovations, but starting a business? That seemed like a leap too big to consider. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've always just seen myself as a handyman, you know? Someone who fixes things when they break. Running a business sounds complicated." "It can be," Evelyn agreed. "But it doesn't have to be overwhelming. You could start small, focus on local projects, build a reputation, and if you need help getting started, I'd be happy to support you however I can." Her offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Mark stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Here was Evelyn, someone who'd already given him so much, a paycheck, a sense of purpose, a renewed belief in himself, and now she was offering even more, a chance to dream bigger. "I'll think about it," he said finally, though the seed of an idea had already taken root in his mind. Over the following weeks, Mark began laying the groundwork for a new venture. With Evelyn's guidance, he drafted a simple business plan, reached out to contractors he'd worked with during the renovations, and even designed a logo using Sophie's drawings as inspiration. It wasn't easy juggling this alongside parenting and odd jobs, but the excitement kept him going. Every step forward felt like proof that he was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued her efforts to revitalize the neighborhood. True to her word, she offered affordable ownership opportunities to long-term tenants, ensuring the community remained diverse and inclusive. Families who had once feared eviction now proudly called these homes their own, planting gardens, painting walls, and adding personal touches that made each house unique. One crisp spring morning, Mark received a letter in the mail. It was from Evelyn, handwritten on elegant stationery. Inside she wrote, "Dear Mark, I wanted to thank you for everything, not just for the incredible work you've done on this project, but for reminding me of the power of connection. Before you came into my life, I thought I was content living quietly, keeping to myself. But you showed me that there's joy in leaning on others, in letting people in. You've inspired me to keep dreaming, to keep giving back. And I hope, in some small way, I've done the same for you. Take care." Mark read the note twice, his throat tightening with emotion. He tucked it away carefully, knowing it was something he'd treasure forever. By summer, Mark's new business was officially up and running. He called it Thompson Builds, a nod to both his family name and the idea that building wasn't just about structures. It was about creating spaces where people could thrive. His first project? A custom playhouse for Sophie, designed with Liam's input and built with the help of friends he'd made along the way. On the day it was finished, Evelyn came by to see it. She stood back, admiring the tiny structure with its bright blue shutters and flower boxes spilling over with daisies. "It's perfect," she said, smiling, "just like the man who built it." Mark laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, I couldn't have done it without you, any of it." Evelyn stepped closer, her expression softening. "We make a good team, don't we?" "We do," he agreed, meeting her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, almost instinctively, Evelyn reached out and took his hand. Mark held it firmly, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the sun beating down overhead. As they stood there together, surrounded by the laughter of children and the hum of a thriving community, Mark knew one thing for certain. Life wasn't about avoiding challenges or escaping pain. It was about finding light in the darkness, strength in vulnerability, and love in unexpected places. And sometimes, all it took was a broken porch to bring two people together and rebuild a world.